comfortable and peaceful life. South Korea could have lived a comfortable and peaceful life in Northeast Asia, but the current President Yoon Seo insisted on making the country angry. After he came to power, he pursued a humiliating foreign policy towards the United States and Japan, which not only caused the dignity of South Korea to be smashed to the end, but also annoyed the two major neighboring countries, China and Russia, in order to please the United States and Japan. As a result, South Korea, like Japan, became China, one of the targets of Russia's key countermeasures. Recently, the air forces of China and Russia organized and implemented the 6th Joint Air Strategic Cruise. While strategic bombers from the two countries entered the Sea of Japan from the East China Sea, they also flew around the Air Defense Identification Zone of South Korea, which triggered the South Korean military's panic. Highly anticipated. According to Observer.com, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff stated on the 6th that 4 Chinese and 4 Russian military aircraft entered its Air Defense Identification Zone that day, but did not invade its airspace. According to the news released by the South Korean military, the South Korean military subsequently issued a stern warning to Chinese and Russian military aircraft entering its Air Defense Identification Zone, and scrambled to take off fighter jets to track and monitor. There is a big difference in the response methods of Chinese and Russian military pilots. According to the South Korean military, the Chinese bomber pilots responded to South Korea's so-called severe warning by conducting routine combat patrol exercises. The Russian bomber pilots did not respond to the South Korean warning. From the response and reaction of the Chinese and Russian bombers to the warning of the South Korean military, we can see that the two countries have different attitudes towards South Korea. When the Chinese pilots received the warning sent by the South Korean military via radio, they were still willing to take care of them and responded through normal international channels, which seemed more professional. But the Russian bomber pilots were too lazy to respond to South Korea's warning. It can also be seen from a perspective that, unlike China, which still has a large room for maneuver in its attitude towards South Korea, Russia's attitude towards South Korea is not only tougher, but even more hostile. South Korea's Ministry of National Defense has lodged a serious protest to Chinese and Russian military attachés over the entry of Chinese and Russian military aircraft into the Air Defense Identification Zone designated by South Korea without prior notice. Moreover, South Korea also asked China and Russia to take appropriate measures to prevent such incidents from happening again. You must know that the joint strategic cruise of the Chinese and Russian bombers did not enter the airspace of South Korea, but only passed through the Air Defense Identification Zone of South Korea, and the Air Defense Identification Zone is an airspace designated by a country alone, which does not have the force of international law. On the grounds that other countries have notified in advance, South Korea groundlessly accused China and Russia, and took off fighter jets hastily in an attempt to fight, which shows the sensitivity and fragility of the Yoon Seo government. In fact, it is no wonder that the Russian military pilots are unwilling to listen to the South Korean military's propaganda, because the damage caused to Russia-South Korea relations by South Korea's fall to the United States is far greater than the damage to China-South Korea relations. Therefore, unlike China and South Korea, which still maintain diplomatic and economic and trade ties, Russia has included South Korea in its unfriendly country blacklist, which has led to the lowest point in Russia-South Korea relations since the establishment of diplomatic relations. Although South Korea has not publicly imposed sanctions on Russia, nor has it publicly provided deadly weapons to Ukraine, but this does not mean that South Korea will not cause substantial damage to Russia. At least, South Korean-made artillery shells have appeared on the Ukrainian battlefield to kill Russian soldiers. Not long ago, the United States purchased 100,000 155mm artillery shells from South Korea and sent them directly to the Ukrainian army to fight against the Russian army. Although South Korea has repeatedly stressed that it will not provide deadly weapons to Ukraine, under the role of the United States, South Korea has actually indirectly provided weapons to Ukraine. Moreover, as the resources of NATO countries in terms of military aid to Ukraine are gradually exhausted, no one can guarantee that the United States will not put pressure on South Korea to force it to openly provide military aid to Ukraine. Regarding the issue of South Korea's provision of weapons to Ukraine, the Russian side has also issued a warning before, to let the South Koreans feel the taste of Russia's provision of advanced weapons to North Korea. Therefore, the fact that the Russian military aircraft did not respond to South Korea's call this time should be to create a greater degree of deterrence for South Korea. Therefore, the Russian pilots ignored the South Korean military's warnings this time. It should not be because of communication problems with the Russian fighter jets, or because the Russian pilots inadvertently ignored the Korean side's call. On the contrary, This is more like sending some kind of signal to the country. Russia hopes that Yin Zhu's government will keep its promise on the issue of military aid to Ukraine, and not go back on its word because of the instigation of the United States. After all, given South Korea's current attitude of respectful respect for the United States, no one can guarantee that they will not openly provide weapons to Ukraine because they cannot withstand the pressure of the United States in the future. What South Korea should be most aware of now is that Russia has recently announced the expansion of its military in response to NATO's military threats. Obviously, Russia intends to fight to the death with the United States and NATO on the conflict in Ukraine. As one of the important allies of the United States, South Korea has always been submissive to the United States, and no one can guarantee that it will not be involved in the vortex of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the future. Therefore, Russia sent its strategic bombers to South Korea's air defense identification zone and did not respond to the other party's warning. It seems to be reminding South Korea that it is best to stay away from the Ukraine issue to avoid getting burned. In addition, the completely different response styles of Chinese and Russian pilots to the South Korean Air Defense Identification Zone warning inquiry is also related to the fact that Russia does not have such an airspace management system as the Air Defense Identification Zone. There are about 20 countries in the world that have established air defense identification zones, but Russia, which has always been very strong, has never been included. Even in the Soviet era, the Soviet Air Defense Force did not set up an air defense identification zone. The establishment of an air defense identification zone is a manifestation of the Western air defense combat system. At the beginning, it was mainly NATO member countries plus countries such as Japan and South Korea. The Chinese Air Force has studied the Soviet-style homeland air defense system in the past few decades, and has fully studied the Western Air Force system in recent years. Only in 2013 did it propose the concept of an air defense identification zone and announce the establishment of the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, but it has not yet been established. South China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone. The ADIZ is not something that can be done just by talking about it. Disclosure to the enemy first is a basic requirement. The significance of establishing an air defense identification zone is to carry out early warning and airspace control. These means are very important, and it is necessary to establish a complete set of huge combat systems including radars, satellites, aviation, command posts, and information release. The Russian Air Force has completely inherited the combat system of the Soviet Air Force. They do not have the concept of an air defense identification zone, nor do they plan to establish an identification zone. However, the strategic bombers of the Russian long-range aviation force flew all over the air defense identification zones of the surrounding United States, Japan, Europe, and other countries. China announced the establishment of the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone on November 23, 2013, and it has been implemented for 10 years.